checks. It's about time the government stepped in to do something there as well.
Thank you, Senator Sheldon. I call Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise to address the Security Legislation Amendment Critical Infrastructure Bill of 2020, noting that the government has brought in some amendments. I'm, like some of my colleagues, also a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. Have been for a number of years, and this is probably one of the first times where I have seen the agencies get to the point where they haven't done sufficient consultation with industry. But it's an example, I think, of where this committee is very effective in that on a bipartisan basis we're able to work with agencies, industries, get an understanding of where things sat, and hence the recommendation to split the bill, which many of my colleagues have talked about. They have also talked about some of the particular measures in the bill. So what I plan to do at the time I have available here is to give people who may be listening to this debate a little more background on some of the emerging trends overseas and also here in Australia, and to particularly look at some of the evidence that was provided to the committee by Ms Noble, who heads up ASD, because I think that really speaks to the heart of why these step-in powers are required, and we do need to get this right with industry. The first one I'd like to go to actually took place in Ukraine in 2015. And the reason I talk about this particular cyber attack is it is the first time experts believe there has been a large-scale, grid-level attack that has been successful on a modern nation. So the control centres of 3 Ukrainian electricity distribution companies were remotely accessed, and they opened the breakers at some 30 distribution substations in Kiev and a western region, causing more than 200,000 consumers to lose power. Now, in this case, the hackers gained entry through a sophisticated spear phishing campaign and used a black energy malware to cause havoc in Ukraine. Governments and cybersecurity companies have attributed the hacks to Russian groups with suspected, albeit not proven, and unclear links to the Russian government. Now, this has occurred on the back of the 2014 incursion, if you recall, not only the annexation of Crimea, but the incursion by Russian-supported forces in the eastern part of Ukraine. And many people believe that this area of Ukraine has become a bit of a playground for Russia and other actors to test, essentially, their capabilities in the cyberspace. In 2017, there was a subsequent hack that broke into thousands of Ukrainian networks by sabotaging a fairly widely used piece of software, and that attack disabled around 10% of computers in Ukraine and inflicted financial costs to about 0.5% of Ukraine's GDP. So if you think about what 0.5% of our GDP would mean here in Australia, that's a significant amount of money. So a number of companies and foreign governments, in fact, have looked to help Ukraine, freeing up aid and other investment to try and boost their ability for cybersecurity. Latvia has also experienced crises there, and the most recent ones probably are the 2 in the States that have made the media. One is the SolarWinds cyber attack, and that's one of the most sophisticated and large-scale cyber operations that's ever been identified. The US government stated the operation was an intelligence-gathering effort, and they've attributed it to an actor that is most likely Russian in origin. The president of Microsoft said it was the largest, most sophisticated attack the world has ever seen, and it affected federal agencies, courts, the private sector, state and local governments across the US. The more recent one, in May this year, was the attack and shutdown of one of the US's major pipelines that supplied fuel infrastructure. And so they stole data from the company, as well as demanding a large ransom to get things going again. So that's on the global scene. You can see that actors are using cyber means to impact critical infrastructure, either for criminal intent in terms of money or for espionage in terms of stealing money, or from a grey zone technique in terms of undermining the community's confidence and potentially diminishing a nation's capacity to control its own defence when you lack things like electricity or communications. More recently, starting to involve Australia, in July of this year, Australia, the European Union, the United Kingdom, the United States, for the first time attributed publicly that an attack that affected some 30,000 businesses around the world involving ransomware and IP theft, they attributed that to the Ministry of State Security of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the threshold for attribution is quite high, but what that indicates is that when the strategic update of 2021 talks about the fact that grey zone activities are increasing, we are seeing very tangible examples of that here in Australia. And the consequences of disruptions in our digital systems are quite extreme, not only from those obvious blockages or thefts, but we've seen a couple of failures just in the aviation industry, not necessarily attributable to malware or cyber attack, but it gives an indication of how that could be used to significantly disrupt the normal operations of a country. And just one here in Australia, when the ticketing system for Virgin globally went down, we saw massive delays of travel around Australia due to that ticketing and freight and luggage loading system going down. And so it doesn't take too much to, as you compare what happened through COVID, the impact when passenger flights weren't flying, on trade, on services such as mail, banking, etc., for the movement of notes and other things around the country, those can have significant impacts by attacks on critical infrastructure where they fail. So at the heart of the contention in this bill were concerns by industry around the step-in powers that were proposed by the original bill. And I think it's really instructive to go to the evidence provided by Ms Noble, the head of ASD, because a lot of people have indicated that industry cooperates, and that's acknowledged, and in fact that is the vast majority of players in Australia, whether they be state governments or the private sector. So to quote here some evidence from ASD during the inquiry, Ms Noble said, "We do have some wonderful examples of incredible cooperation. You might recall that in 2019 there was a significant impact of ransomware against the Victorian health system. That's a good example. We have a close relationship with the Victorian Government, and they also had a private incident response provider. So this was a terrific example of state government, federal government and private sector working together. Good looks like this. They contacted us, so we were able to work with them. They provided us with technical information for their networks like logs and images of disks. That happened on day one. Within 24 hours, we sent incident responders on the ground to work side by side with the Victorian Government and the private entity impact, their private service provider and staff from the Australian Cyber Security Centre. We were able to fully map the network quickly and identify the nature of the criminality." And so that's an example ASD provided of how things can, often do and should work for the benefit of the Australian people. But Ms Noble went on to say, and I quote, "Bad looks like this." And this is a real example, but I'm not going to give names because that's really important. "We found out something happened because there were media reports. Then we tried to reach out to the company to clarify if the media reports were true, and they didn't want to talk to us. We kept pushing. Sometimes we have to use our own very senior level contacts, sometimes through people who might know members of boards or chairs of boards, to try and establish trust and build a willingness to cooperate. At times we've spent nearly a week negotiating with lawyers about us being able to even just obtain basic information that I described in the first scenario. asking, can we please just have some data from your network that we might be able to help by telling you quickly who it is, what they're doing and what they might do next. In this case I'm referring to, and I'm still quoting here from Ms Noble, 5 days later we were still getting very sluggish engagement, and we were trying to get them to provide data to us and deploy some of our tools so that we could work out what was happening on their networks. That goes on for 13 days. This incident had a national impact on our country, and on day 14 we were only able to provide them with generic protection advice, and their network was still down. 3 months later, they got reinfected and it all started again." End quote. So it's important to understand that when we talk about step-in powers, we're talking about scenarios like that, where with good cooperation, you see that there is a seamless working together side by side with people helping each other out, and you get quick resolutions of these incidents which can be damaging to Australia's ability to run an effective, free first world nation and the services that Australians depend on. But where, for whatever reason, a commercial provider chooses not to engage with ASD, and the flow-on effects are going for days, if not weeks, and impacting on Australia's and Australia's capabilities, then it's appropriate that ASD is given the legal authority to step in to work still with, not against, but with that provider because of the obligations for them to report and to cooperate. It's important to understand that the threat environment is deteriorating. There's been a 60% increase in ransomware attacks against Australian entities between last year and this year. We see both state-based actors and criminals acting against Australian entities. They're motivated by a range of imperatives, from espionage to generating influence to interference to preparing to or actually disrupting, degrading or denying services. And some, as I've said, purely have the motivation of stealing money. There's also a broader economic cost. Some of the evidence, again from ASD, was that AusCyber have estimated that the significant cyber attack against Australia could cost around $30 billion and 160,000 or so jobs. And so that's ASD and industry's assessment of what a cyber attack, a significant cyber attack here in Australia that is sustained, could be. And that's why these measures are important. It's interesting that just over 1/3 of all incidents that have been reported to ASD, the Cyber Security Centre, over the past 12 months were related to critical infrastructure. And the assessment is, because that reporting is currently voluntary, that that's only a fraction of what has probably occurred. Hence the requirements not only for the step-in powers but also for the reporting within the 12 hours if it's a critical and significant event. So in the advisory report on this Security Legislation Amendment Critical Infrastructure Bill of 2020, the committee has recommended that the emergency powers be swiftly legislated in a standalone bill with a second separate bill to be introduced after further consultation. And this two-step approach, which the government has agreed to and we're now dealing with today, will enable the quick passage of laws to counter the looming threats against Australia's critical infrastructure, while giving businesses and government the additional time to do the co-design work on the most effective regulatory framework to ensure the long-term security of our critical infrastructure. As other colleagues have mentioned, our committee, the PJCIS, made 14 recommendations in relation to the bill. We received compelling evidence that the complexity and frequency of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure is increasing globally. Australia is not immune. There's clear recognition from government and industry that we need to do more. And this first bill, Bill 1, is to expand the critical infrastructure sectors that are covered by the Act, to introduce government assistance measures to be used as a last resort in crisis scenarios, as well as mandating reporting obligations. And I encourage senators to support the bill.